We ended last week's lecture series with a discussion of the Gettier paper and the Feldman paper. We noted that both of these papers tried to articulate counterexamples to the justified true belief definitional theory of knowledge. Now, I call it a definitional theory of knowledge because, as I've suggested, it is a theory of knowledge that has the form of a rigorous definition. It specifies a set of individually necessary conditions. Something must be a belief, it must be true, and it must be justified. Each of these things are individually necessary. When all of those conditions are met, together they are jointly sufficient for the belief to count as knowledge. And so this theory acts like a definition, an extremely rigorous definition that provides us really with an effective decision procedure. We can go through the world and look at every single candidate for knowledge, and we can say, do they have a belief? Do they have a true belief? Do they have a justified true belief? If they do, then they count as knowledge. If they're missing one or more, then they fail to count as knowledge. So we can decide definitively in every case whether or not the individual has knowledge in that case or not. Gettier and Feldman present us with counterexamples that seem to suggest that that second part of the equation, the sufficiency side, isn't going to hold up under scrutiny. They give us cases in which, from our intuitive perspective, it seems as though the subjects in these cases have beliefs that are true and justified. But we also have an intuition that the subjects don't know in those circumstances. And so it seems as though we can have a justified true belief that fails to count as knowledge, and hence those conditions together are not jointly sufficient. As we noted, that doesn't have any implications directly for whether or not those individual conditions are individually necessary or not. It's not spoken to by these counterexamples. However, the sufficiency side seems to be challenged by these counterexamples. We notice that people initially construed these as inherently inferential. That is, they involve inferential transfer of justification, transferring justification through inference from initial evidence and to the target belief. They then criticize the cases in the Gettier paper by noting that in each of those cases, that inferential transfer has an intermediary false belief. And they then argue that, in fact, even though it might initially seem have a prima facie intuition that the person is justified, they in fact are not justified, because you cannot get justification transfer through an inferential chain if the inferential chain has a false intermediary belief. Enter people like Chisholm, people like Skirms, people like Feldman, people like Goldman, who then say, well, wait a minute though. We can formulate Gettier type cases or epistemic luck kinds of cases in which there is no false intermediary belief. And so it doesn't look as if you need that false intermediary belief, and hence, once again, it seems as though those Gettier style or epistemic luck cases challenge the justified true belief account of knowledge. Once we recognize that there isn't false belief, we can then try to characterize what's going on in Gettier cases in terms of misleading evidence. And it's important, as we noted, that as we start to look at the cases that get offered up, for instance, Chisholm's sheep in a field case, they look less like explicit inferential transfer of justification, but instead they seem to involve things like perceptual belief formation and so on. And so while they do pose challenges to inferential transfer of justification, they also seem to just pose challenges generally. And so we want to take a moment and think about what the nature of that challenge really seems to be. So let's look at the Gettier case from the perspective of how we see the Gettier subject and their epistemic position, and how the Gettier subject seems themselves and their epistemic position. So in each of the cases that we described, Gettier's original cases and these new Gettier type cases that don't involve false beliefs, that might involve things like perceptual judgments instead, all of them seem to turn on this notion that the person is making an inference using an inferential principle, or they're making a judgment based upon some structural feature of the world or a reliable correlation within the world or so on. And normally those inferential principles or structural features are truth-promoting ways to form beliefs. So from the Gettierized subject's perspective, from the person inside this vignette, inside this counterexample, it appears for all the world that they're doing the epistemically responsible thing. They're deliberately trying to form a belief in a way that is truth-promoting. However, in all of these cases, we, as the consumer of the vignette, are given this extra bit of information. While these, in fact, are generally truth-promoting structural features of the world or inferential principles and so on, in this particular case, they fail, and it's only an accident that the person forms a true belief, given that the normal truth-promoting nature of these things has been undermined by a special set of circumstances. Now this, I suggest, is what drives our intuitions here. Because we see the subject acting in this epistemically responsible way, relying on the structural feature or inferential principle that is normally a truth-promoting means of forming beliefs, we judge them. We have an intuition that they are justified in their belief, and it's specified that their belief is true, so it seems intuitively like they have a justified true belief. But from our perspective outside that vignette, with our extra knowledge about the failure of this structural feature or inferential principle, we're in this unique position from our third-person perspective to judge the epistemic status of their belief in light of our understanding of their situation. And when we look at their situation, given our extra bit of knowledge, we think, hey, they don't actually know. Their belief is true. They're justified in the sense that they made this conscientious effort to apply a truth-promoting structural feature or inferential principle. Nevertheless, their belief is only true by accident because that normally truth-promoting feature is in fact, in this particular case, not truth-promoting. When we turn to Goldman, we want to look at Goldman's response to this, because this fundamental break between evidence and belief, between initial information and judgments that we make. This seems like a general problem for epistemology overall. It's not linked specifically to inferential transfer of justification, though certainly those cases are affected. It also seems to involve perceptual belief formation and so on. And so we want to look and see how Goldman responds to it. And we'll be looking for what the mechanism is that seeks to assure that this breakdown in the normal truth-promoting nature of these things is prevented by the mechanisms that Goldman introduces. So how will we structure our lecture today on Goldman's causal theory of knowledge? We'll start off by looking at a framework for thinking about causal theories generally. Then we'll look at traditional causal theories as just one instance of this general strategy. We'll see that this traditional causal framework has to be modified or tinkered with to try and get all the cases right. And we'll wonder whether or not that tinkering is consistent with the original causal framework, or if it in fact renders the causal framework. After we place traditional causal theories within this larger overarching causal theories framework and showed how traditional causal theorists have to tinker with the basic model that they proposed in order to try and capture as many cases as possible under the umbrella of their theory, we'll then turn our attention to Goldman's theory as presented in that 1967 paper. We'll talk about how the theory operates, and then we'll turn our attention to how it deals with Gettier cases specifically. Once we've discussed Goldman's proposal for dealing with Gettier cases, then we'll turn to some other problems that we can raise for the theory that lead Goldman ultimately to propose the theory of justification that we'll talk about in the next lecture on Goldman's What is Justification?